The stage lights dimmed to a single spotlight, and in that circle of gold stood Mia McClure, known to her city as Mia Love Live. Her voice rising in a gospel melody that seemed to crack open the very air. Behind her, 3 figures in white moved like breath itself. Their harmonies weaving through hers, not backup singers, she would later explain, but angels bearing witness to a story she never thought she'd tell. The audience at Charlotte's Stage Door Theatre sat in that peculiar stillness that comes when something sacred is being unveiled. When a woman stands before strangers and offers them the broken pieces of her faith, trusting that somehow, in the telling, those fragments might become whole again. It was June 2025, and this performance wasn't just a show, was a revival, a reckoning, a return. She called it good news, a redemptive work, but really, it was the sound of a soul finding its way back home. The melody swelled and fell like breathing, and in that rhythm was the story of every person who had ever walked away from God, angry and certain they would never return. Mia's hands moved through the air as if she were gathering invisible threads, pulling together the moments that had led her here, the hurt, the rage, the long silence, and finally, impossibly, the morning when prayer became possible again. The music told what words alone could not, that the journey back to faith is never a straight line, that it winds through dark spaces and doubt, through blame and bitterness, before it finds the light. The theater felt smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. This was the moment she had feared and prayed for in equal measure. The moment when she would speak the truth about church hurt, about the God she had blamed, about the 4 years she spent running from the very thing her soul needed most. But to understand how she arrived on that stage, bathed in light and singing redemption, you have to go back to the girl she was before the breaking, before the anger, before the leaving, before the long night of the soul that nearly cost her everything. You have to see Charlotte as she saw it. Home heritage. The rhythm of her heartbeat. Mia McClure grew up in the embrace of gospel music and church pews, in a city that was changing faster than memory could hold. In a family that taught her to love God with the same certainty they taught her to breathe. The hymns were in her bones before she had words for them. Sunday mornings meant the warmth of community, the sound of voices rising together, the sense of belonging to something larger than herself. She was a Charlotte native through and through, rare in a city where so many were transplants, and that deep-rootedness gave her both strength and a fierce loyalty to the places and people that shaped her. Before we continue, leave your like, share our story and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. She studied sociology at Appalachian State University, drawn to understanding how people connect, how communities form and fracture, how stories bind us together or tear us apart. After graduating in 2012, she returned to Charlotte and poured herself into creative work. Radio personality, podcast host, performer, storyteller. She created This Is My Brain on Anxiety, a raw, honest exploration of mental health in the Black community that earned her recognition and respect. She made Sincerely, Charlotte, a love letter to the city's vanishing landmarks, to the places that raised her and the stories that were being erased by gentrification. Her art was always about connection, about seeing people, about honoring what was real and true. And through it all, her faith was the foundation, the lens through which she understood the world and her place in it. But faith, like any relationship, can be wounded. It can be betrayed. The church that had been her sanctuary became the source of her deepest pain, and she would not speak the details of that hurt, not publicly, not in a way that would expose others or turn testimony into accusation. What mattered was that she was hurt, deeply and profoundly, by people who claimed to represent God, by those who should have been safe, but weren't. The wound was personal and specific, and it opened a chasm between her and the God she thought she knew. In that moment of injury, her faith didn't just waver, it shattered. She walked away from the church, and in her mind, she walked away from God himself, certain that the two were so intertwined that you couldn't have one without the other. She was wrong about that, but she wouldn't know it for years. The leaving wasn't quiet or peaceful. It was loud with anger. sharp with accusation, bitter with disappointment. Mia blamed God for what people had done, and once that blame took root, it grew into something darker, a rage that colored everything. That turned prayer into silence and worship into absence. She stopped going to church, stopped reading scripture, stopped believing that any of it mattered. When people on the street would ask if they could pray for her, she would refuse, sometimes sharply, protecting herself from what she now saw as hypocrisy and false comfort. She found community elsewhere, among people who didn't claim to represent Christ, but who, in her eyes, embodied his love better than those who did. They were kinder, more accepting, less judgmental. They met her where she was without trying to fix or save her. And in that kindness, she found a temporary home, a place to rest while the wound ached and bled. For 4 years, she lived in what she would later call darker spaces, not evil or destructive, but places where faith was absent, where God's name was not spoken, where she could be angry in peace. She worked on her art, built her career, created powerful pieces about anxiety and loss and the gentrification of her beloved Charlotte. She was productive, even successful, but there was an emptiness that art couldn't fill, a God-shaped hollow that she refused to acknowledge. She told herself she was fine, that she had moved on, that she didn't need the faith that had failed her. But the heart knows its own truth, and hers was aching. The anger that had felt so righteous at first began to wear thin, becoming heavy rather than freeing. She carried it everywhere, this weight of blame and bitterness, and it exhausted her. The people who loved her outside the church were genuine and good, but something was still missing: a center, a purpose, a connection to the divine that no human relationship could replace. By the end of 2023, something inside her began to shift. She couldn't name it at first, couldn't identify the slow thaw that was happening in her heart. But it was there, whisper, a possibility, a door that she thought was locked, forever standing slightly ajar. Maybe it was exhaustion, the weariness of carrying anger for so long. Maybe it was grief, the recognition that in walking away from the church, she had also walked away from something true and vital. Maybe it was simply time, the way wounds heal when you stop picking at them, when you let them breathe. Whatever the cause, she found herself thinking about God again. Not with rage, but with something, softer curiosity, perhaps, or longing. She began, tentatively, to pray again, though the prayers felt rusty and awkward, like a language she had once been fluent in, but had forgotten. She wasn't ready to return to church, wasn't ready to forgive the people who had hurt her, but she was willing to consider that maybe God and the church weren't the same thing after all. All of 2024 became a year of slow repair, of rebuilding a relationship she had thought was irretrievable. She spent time in scripture again, approached it not with the eyes of someone looking for rules, but with the heart of someone looking for connection. She prayed every morning, sometimes just sitting in silence, letting God's presence wash over her without words or agenda. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old anger flared up, when the wounds felt fresh again, when she wanted to walk away, all over again. But she stayed. She showed up to prayer the way you show up to therapy, knowing that healing is slow and often painful, that you have to touch the wound to clean it. She stopped avoiding people who wanted to pray for her. She stopped pretending she didn't need God. She started calling herself a Part 2 Christian, a term she coined to describe someone who had walked away and come back, someone whose faith had died and been resurrected, someone who knew both the bitterness of absence and the sweetness of return. Then came the morning that changed everything, or rather, the morning when God made clear what he had been preparing in her all along. She was praying, as had become her habit, in the quiet of early light, when suddenly she saw it, a vision of a show, a performance, a one-woman theatrical experience, unlike anything she had created before. It came to her whole, not in pieces, but complete: the music, the movement, the message. She saw herself on stage telling her story of leaving and returning, of hurt and healing, of anger and forgiveness. She saw the 3 singers behind her, not as backup, but as angels, bearing witness and offering worship. She saw the audience, people who had their own wounds, their own reasons for walking away, their own hunger for a faith that didn't demand perfection but welcomed brokenness. The vision was so clear, so specific, that it scared her. She didn't know what to call it yet, that would come later, but she knew it was real, knew it was from God, and knew that it would require more vulnerability than she had ever shown. She fought against the vision at first, tried to talk herself out of it, tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, just wishful thinking, just the creative mind playing tricks. But it wouldn't leave her. It stayed with her through the day, appeared in her dreams, whispered to her in quiet moments. The more she tried to push it away, the stronger it became, until finally she had no choice but to surrender to it. This was her assignment, her calling. The reason God had walked with her through the dark years and brought her back to light. She was meant to tell this story, not for her own sake alone, but for everyone who had been hurt by the church, for everyone who had blamed God for what humans did, for everyone who thought they could never come back. She was meant to create a space where people could be honest about their wounds, where church hurt was named and acknowledged, where returning to faith didn't mean pretending the pain never happened. The work of creating good news, a redemptive work, became its own test of faith. Every step forward seemed to meet resistance, doubts, fears, practical obstacles that felt designed to make her quit. There were moments when she wondered if she had misheard God, if the vision had been nothing more than her own desire dressed up as divine instruction. She questioned herself constantly, wrestled with the fear that going public with her faith journey would cost her fans, would alienate people who had followed her work, would make her a target for criticism. The platform she had built was rooted in authenticity and vulnerability, but this felt different, riskier. She was about to declare her love for God in a culture that had complicated feelings about Christianity. In a moment when the church was tangled up with politics and power in ways that made many people uncomfortable, she prayed every single day, sometimes multiple times a day, asking God for strength, for clarity, for the courage to keep going. There were practical challenges to finding the right venue, assembling the creative team, writing a script that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. She needed singers who understood the assignment, who could embody the role of angels without making it feel gimmicky or shallow. She needed music that could carry the emotional weight of the story, that could shift from lament to celebration, from despair to hope. She needed to be ruthlessly honest about her own failures, her own anger, her own journey, without turning the show into a therapy session. The balance was delicate. Too much focus on the hurt, and it would become a complaint. Too much focus on the redemption, and it would feel false, like a testimony that skipped over the real work of healing. She had to trust that the truth itself would be enough, that she didn't need to dress it up or tone it down, that people were hungry for stories that didn't pretend faith was easy. As the debut date approached, the fear intensified. She was terrified in a way she had never been before. Even when performing her most vulnerable work about anxiety and mental health, this was different because it touched the most essential part of her identity, the core of who she was and who she was becoming. What if people rejected the message? What if the show fell flat? What if her honesty about church hurt alienated the very community she was trying to reach? What if she was wrong about the vision, about the calling, about all of it? She brought these fears to God in prayer, laying them out like broken pieces, asking Him to take them, or at least to give her the strength to carry them. And slowly, through the process of surrender, the fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It became less about her own reputation and more about faithfulness. Less about success and more about obedience. She began to understand that her job was simply to tell the truth and trust God with the outcome. The night of the debut, June 7, 2025, arrived with all its weight and possibility. The Stage Door Theatre in Uptown Charlotte, filled with people. Some who knew her work, some who had heard about the show through word of mouth, some who were curious about what a redemptive work might look like on stage. The lights went down, and Mia stepped into the spotlight wearing white. A deliberate choice that spoke of purity and new beginnings, of the blank page that faith becomes when you return to it. The three singers behind her, the angels, began to hum. A sound that seemed to come from another realm, and then Mia's voice joined them. Clear and strong, and somehow fragile at the same time. She began to tell her story, not with shame, but with honesty. Not with bitterness, but with the hard-won wisdom of someone who has walked through the valley and emerged on the other side. She talked about church hurt, about the people who were supposed to protect her but didn't. About the way that betrayal feels when it comes from those who claim to represent God. She didn't offer easy answers or platitudes. She didn't say that everything happens for a reason, or that God was testing her faith. She simply said that she was hurt, and that hurt was real, and that she walked away because staying felt impossible. And then, with music swelling around her, she talked about the end of 2023. About the moment when she began to wonder if maybe God wasn't the enemy she had made him out to be. She talked about the year 2024, about the slow, painful work of rebuilding trust, about mornings spent in prayer when she didn't know what to say, about the vision that came to her and wouldn't let her go. The audience was completely silent. The kind of silence that happens when people recognize themselves in someone else's story. When they realize they're not alone in their wounds. She moved across the stage with the music, her body becoming part of the narrative, and the angels behind her echoed her words, amplified her grief and her joy, held space for everything she couldn't say. When she spoke about finding God again, not in the church building but in the quiet of morning prayer, not through human intermediaries but through direct encounter, her voice broke with emotion. This was the heart of the story, the moment of return. The resurrection of a faith that everyone, including her, had thought was dead. She described it not as a dramatic conversion, but as a slow dawn, a gradual lightening of the darkness. A recognition that she had never actually been alone, even in her anger. God had been there all along, waiting, not demanding or condemning, but simply loving. The realization had undone her, had cracked open the hardness around her heart, had made her weep with relief and gratitude. She sang then, a song of praise that felt ripped from her very soul, and the angels joined her, their voices creating a cathedral of sound in that small theater. The audience began to weep too, some quietly, some openly, and the space filled with the kind of holy grief that comes before healing. The final section of the show was a call, not to perfection, but to possibility. Mia looked out at the audience and spoke directly to them, to anyone who had been hurt by the church, to anyone who had walked away from God, to anyone who thought they could never come back. You are not alone, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. Your hurt is real. Your anger is valid. And God is bigger than all of it. She told them that coming back doesn't mean pretending the pain never happened, doesn't mean forgiving before you're ready, doesn't mean returning to the place or people who wounded you. It means opening yourself to the possibility that God and the church are not the same thing. That faith can survive and even thrive outside of institutions. That relationship with the divine is personal and direct and unbreakable by human hands. She told them that she was still scared, still healing, still figuring it out day by day. She told them that being a part-time Christian means carrying both the memory of leaving and the joy of returning, means holding space for doubt and faith at the same time. The show ended not with a neat resolution, but with an invitation to pray, to consider, to open the door just a crack. The angels' voices faded into silence, and Mia stood alone in the spotlight. Her hands open at her sides, her face lifted toward the light. Then the lights went down completely, and in the darkness before the applause, there was a moment of pure stillness, a moment when heaven touched earth, when God's presence was so palpable, you could almost touch it. When the lights came back up, the audience rose to their feet, not with the enthusiasm of entertainment, but with the reverence of witness. They had seen something sacred, something true. Many stayed after the show to talk with Mia, to tell her their own stories of hurt and healing, to ask how she found the courage to return. She listened to each one, prayed with some, wept with others, and understood with deep certainty that this was why God had called her to create the show, not for her own healing alone, but for the healing of her community. In the days and weeks that followed, good news, a redemptive work became more than a performance, it became a movement. People who had seen the show began talking about church hurt in new ways, with less shame and more honesty. They started asking questions about what it means to be a Christian, about whether you can love God and critique the church at the same time, about how to rebuild faith after betrayal. Mia's social media transformed as she shared more about her journey, and while she lost some followers as she had feared, she gained others who were hungry for her particular brand of truth-telling. She received messages from people all over the country who had heard about the show. People who wished they could see it. People who thanked her for putting words to what they had felt but couldn't express. Some confessed that they had been considering returning to church but didn't know if they could. Others said they had given up on God entirely until they heard her story. The show had a residency at the theater, and Mia performed it multiple times, each performance slightly different, responsive to the specific audience in the room. She never got comfortable with it. The vulnerability still scared her. The exposure still made her want to hide, but she learned to trust that fear, to see it as a sign that she was doing something that mattered. She began to understand that her platform, which she had built through years of work on mental health and Charlotte history, had been preparing her for this moment all along. All the skills she had developed as a performer and storyteller, all the trust she had earned with her audience through previous shows, all the vulnerability she had practiced in This Is My Brain on anxiety, all of it had been leading to this larger story of spiritual redemption. God had been weaving it together the whole time, even when she was angry at him, even when she had walked away. She started leading conversations after the shows, creating space for people to share their own experiences of church hurt and spiritual return. These gatherings became sacred in their own right, places where people could speak truths they had never voiced before, where grief and gratitude mingled freely, where judgment was suspended and grace flowed abundantly. Mia discovered that her role wasn't to have all the answers, but simply to create the container, to hold space for others the way God had held space for her during her 4 years of wandering. She found herself becoming a bridge between the church and those who had left it, translating each side to the other, helping both understand that hurt and healing can coexist, that critique and love are not opposites but necessary partners in the work of faith. The show became an offering, a gift not just to those who had walked away, but to those who had stayed, helping them understand why some people leave, and how they might help them return. Mia's faith continued to grow and deepen through the process of performing good news again and again. Each time she stepped on stage to tell her story, she understood it more fully, saw new dimensions of God's faithfulness, recognized new ways that her journey mirrored the journeys of others. She began to see her 4 years of absence not as wasted time, but as essential wilderness, the place where her faith was stripped down to its essence and then rebuilt stronger. She understood that she had to lose her religion, the version of Christianity that was about rules and institutions and human approval, in order to find her faith, the direct relationship with God that no person or organization could mediate or break. The anger that had felt so destructive at the time now seemed like an odd gift. The fire that burned away everything false until only truth remained. She wouldn't choose to go through it again, wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone, but she could be grateful for what it taught her. For the person it made her become. There were still hard days, still moments when the old wounds ached, still times when she questioned whether she was doing the right thing by sharing her story so publicly. The criticism came, as she knew it would, from people who thought she was too focused on hurt and not enough on forgiveness, from people who felt she was attacking the church, from people who believed real Christians don't struggle or doubt or walk away. She tried not to read the comments, tried not to let the judgment seep into her spirit, but it was hard. Each time the doubt crept in, she would return to prayer, to that direct connection with God that was now the foundation of everything. She would remember the vision He had given her, the clear instruction to tell this story, the sense of calling that was stronger than any human opinion. And she would keep going, keep performing, keep creating space for honesty and healing. The work itself became a form of worship, an act of obedience that fed her faith even as it challenged her courage. The story of Mia, Love Live, didn't end with a perfect resolution or a neat bow. Life continued with its complexities and challenges, and faith continued to be something she had to choose daily, sometimes moment by moment. But something fundamental had shifted. She had learned that God was faithful even when humans weren't. That faith could survive betrayal. That walking away didn't mean you couldn't come back. She had learned that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. That sharing your wounds could help others heal theirs. That testimony was one of the most powerful forms of ministry. She carried all of this with her, the hurt and the healing, the leaving and the returning, the anger and the love, and she offered it to anyone who needed to know that they weren't alone. Her music became prayer, her performances became revival, and her life became a living testament to the God who pursues us even when we run, who waits for us in the wilderness, who calls us back home not with condemnation but with love. In the months following the debut, as Good News, a redemptive work continued to touch lives and open conversations. Mia began to understand her calling in a new way. She had always been a storyteller, always been someone who used art to connect people and illuminate truth. But now she saw that her specific gift, her unique contribution, was to tell the stories that others were afraid to tell. To give voice to the experiences that the church often wanted to keep quiet. Church hurt, spiritual doubt, the anger that comes from betrayal by religious institutions. These were realities that millions of people lived with but rarely discussed openly. By speaking her truth on stage, by creating art that acknowledged the darkness as well as the light, she was doing more than performing. She was creating permission for others to be honest, to admit their struggles, to seek healing without shame. This was holy work, and she approached it with reverence and responsibility, knowing that every word she spoke could be either a bomb or a weapon, depending on how she wielded it. As the year progressed, she began to envision what might come next. Good News was just the beginning, she realized. The first chapter in a larger story about faith and creativity, about how art can be a vehicle for spiritual transformation. She started thinking about other stories she could tell, other wounds she could address, other ways she could use her platform to bridge the gap between the sacred and the honest. She dreamed of creating spaces where people could encounter God outside the traditional structures of church, where worship could be raw and real, where questions were welcomed as much as answers. She imagined a community of Part 2 Christians coming together, not to bash the church or to remain forever wounded, but to build something new, a faith that was resilient because it had been tested, deep because it had been fought for, genuine because it had been chosen rather than inherited. The vision was still forming, still evolving, but she knew with certainty that God was in it, guiding it, making a way forward. This account is based on the true story of Mia McClure, known by her stage name, Mia Love Live, a Charlotte, North Carolina artist and performer. The events described including her 4-year departure from the church, her spiritual restoration throughout 2024, her vision during prayer, and the creation and debut of Good News, a redemptive work at Charlotte's Stage Door Theatre in June 2025, were documented in an interview with WFAE 90.7, Charlotte's NPR affiliate, published June 4, 2025. Additional background on Mia's artistic career and educational history was confirmed through Appalachian State University archives and various Charlotte arts publications. The details of her faith journey, her concept of being a Part 2 Christian, and the elements of her theatrical production were drawn directly from her own testimony in the WFAE interview, where she spoke candidly with host Nick de la Canal about church hurt, spiritual detour, and redemption through music and storytelling.